Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you live from Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. Today is the first day back to reality after the holiday onslaught. It's funny. I've talked about. I did a Christmas show last week or the week before. I talked about some of my favorite Christmas movies and how much movies bring back like nostalgic memories of the holidays, particularly around Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's Eve, and especially Halloween. And I love the holidays. I really I turn into kind of like a big kid again around the holidays. I kind of am. I kind of like to think of myself as a big kid anyway, but I also like the day after Christmas, I I go through this period of where it's a funny thing after like presents are done and we're done doing the family thing, we're done eating, and we kind of settle in, and then Christmas is kind of coming to a close. On a technical standpoint, I get my stuff and I get ready to leave. I always get like a little sense of sadness that it's over. It's because there's all this build up for the holidays and all this stuff. And I know for a lot of people, the holidays mean different things. A lot of people have very quiet holidays where they don't do anything. I've talked to a few friends or people that I know. I went out to a show to see my friend's band play the other night, and I ran into a couple of people I hadn't seen in a while, some friends and some people that I know pretty well. And I talked to a few of them, and they were saying how they basically stayed home, Christmas, and it was just them. They did nothing. It was just a regular day. They don't celebrate really any aspect of Christmas. They just, you know, basically have a day off. And one guy I know said that, yeah, I just all I did is I stayed home. I went for a walk, and I ordered Chinese food at 9:30 at night, and that was my Christmas. So didn't even have a tree. Never put up a Christmas tree. So I know there's a lot of people out there that don't really do anything for Christmas. It's just a normal day. And then I know on the other extreme, I think the other like side of the coin of that, or the other kind of extreme of that, or polar opposite of that, people go to these big, huge gatherings, with friends and family, and a lot of the times, especially around family kind of situations, they're not great. They're like dysfunctional people. Like have to be in a room that you have to be in a room with your uncle or your aunt that you just don't get along with, and so a lot of people have that too, where they don't like the holidays because they're forced to be in a room with people that they don't really like and they just don't get along with. For me, it's always been kind of in the middle. It's always been, for the most part, really mellow, but I do like gather with family and we do like a pretty traditional Christmas. But the night of Christmas, after everything is done, and after all the hype and everything, I always get this weird kind of sense of a little bit of sadness, and it's like super melancholy because of all the buildup. And it was a great day, but then you're like, oh, it's over, okay. But then it's funny because usually a day or two later, I'm done with Christmas. I like the day after Christmas, I put away all my Christmas stuff. I pack up my tree and get rid of my lights, everything and anything related to Christmas. I go through this period of where I'm kind of sick of it and I'm done with it and I'm glad it's over. And I get that way. That's how I feel today. I feel like I'm glad this stuff is done. We don't really put in my family. We don't put like a lot of emphasis on gifts and so much of the consumer driven aspect. Plus, I don't have to shop for a lot of people, so it's pretty low key. But I know for some people it's a marathon, so I don't usually get caught up in that. But at the same time, I'm glad it's over. So it's pretty funny. But so yesterday, like I said, I went or the day before on New Year's Eve. I was in Portland with some friends, and then on the way back, which was yesterday, New Year's Day, I went We were in South Portland, and I stopped at the Bull Moose in South Portland, which I've only been to that location once, and it's amazing. It's definitely the biggest Bull Moose location I've seen. From my house here in Northport, just about 2 hours because it's in South Portland. So you go past Portland, so it's a little bit further. It's about 15 minutes or so further. It's by the airport and by the mall, and it's like a real built up area. But the Bull Moose there is just incredible. It's massive. It's when I went in there, I went in there with my friend Aaron Kirkpatrick, and we were up super super late. Didn't have very much sleep, so it was kind of out of it. But we weren't sure if they were open, and then we called or looked them up online, and they were open. They opened at like 10 on New Year's Day, so we went over there about 10:30, 11 after we kind of checked out of the hotel and all that stuff, and it was amazing. I was kind of overwhelmed by the amount of things that they have there and the amount of choices. Like massive, massive spread of movies, books, and all that good stuff. Just phenomenal. So I spent probably about 2 hours in there looking around, and I got some totally killer movies. I took a chance, like I've said before, on a couple of other videos, of where my buying habits for a lot of movies has changed. Now, when I buy movies, especially Blu-rays, new releases, I especially like buy movies that I haven't seen. Occasionally, I still buy movies that I did see, when I was a kid or blah blah blah. But I typically the majority of the stuff I buy now for Blu-rays are a lot of films I've never seen before. I kind of one of the things I try to do, and that's relatively new, but I've always kind of been that way. But one of the things I try to do now, especially, is I try to seek out like the most kind of bizarre or the most like obscure movie that I can find, just to add to my collection and to just take a chance, and maybe it will be something that will blow my mind. And I've really lucked out. There's only maybe one movie that I can think of that was pretty disappointing, but even that I wouldn't even say is a disappointment. And I usually, one of the other things I try to do, if I'm at like a place, say like Goodwill, like I've talked about Goodwill in Rockland, if I'm there, if they have Blu-rays on, you know, it could be anything from like action movies to the Marvel movies to whatever there is. But if it's on Blu-ray and if it's a movie I like, I'll buy it. I don't have any like, I don't know, stipulations as far as what genre it is or what year it's from. If it's a movie I've seen or looks really really cool, maybe I've only seen it once or I've seen it a couple times and I really like it, or I've seen it in a theater, I'll just snatch it up. I've done that mostly at the Goodwill in Rockland, Maine. Most of my movies that I have that are like, I have tons of I've acquired a lot of the Marvel movies. I'm a big superhero fan, so I've gotten a pretty good collection of most of those movies, and I've got them all through there. But when I go to Blue Moose, I try to focus on getting kind of the most obscure movie I can get. I try to always get like really underground or exploitation movies, and I try to get films that are older. I try to always get stuff that's like from like the late '60s, '70s, and '80s. You know, and I typically get movies around the time period of from like mid '70s to early '80s, like '82, '83. It's a funny thing, but I typically like, that's my favorite period of exploitation, and with all the things that entails, and I just love that period. That's my favorite period of movie making. So that's usually what I do. I usually, like, when I find a movie that looks really wild or crazy, or that looks super interesting or really just dirty or raw, I'll usually check check the dates. And if it's usually like a Vinegar Syndrome release, or like Blue Underground release, or Synapse release, Mondo Macabre release, it's usually always gold. So the other thing that helps me decide now, because it can be overwhelming like it was the other day, is now that I'm been buying a lot of these movies, I'm getting more and more familiar with these companies, these labels. So that helps me decide on things, especially around films that I've never seen before, and it's great. So yesterday was awesome. I bought a pretty good group of movies that I've never seen before. There was one. Oh, actually, I take that back. There's none of the movies I bought yesterday. I bought about 4 or 5 new movies, and I haven't seen any of them. Actually, in one movie I did buy, but I bought it at Target uh, on Christmas Eve, or sorry, on New Year's Eve. We had to go to Target to get some supplies for that night. Chips and beer and some food stuff. I did buy Dune. I bought Dune on Blu-ray, which is such an amazing movie. So I'm really looking forward to watching that and doing a show on that. It was directed by Denis Villeneuve, who's one of my favorite directors. And that's a big Hollywood budget movie, but it was a really good price, and it's one of my favorite movies that came out last year. And I love Denis Villeneuve. He's one of my favorite directors, so I snatched that up. But Bull Moose, I got a bunch of like these weird kind of exploitation, super low budget movies. And one of the movies that I've heard about is this bad boy right here, Creature from Black Lake. And I've never seen this movie. I just recently heard about it. There's a great little YouTube show slash podcast where they had recently they had these two guests on the show that were the guys who run Synapse, which is this label here. Synapse is one of the premier companies out there right now putting out Blu-rays and 4Ks, and they really specialize in a lot of, all they specialize in all things horror and science fiction and sex exploitation movies and like super low budget cult movies. Kind of my jam, my favorite style of films. And they pretty much, knock it out of the park all the time, as well as those other companies. I've said before, but I'll say it again. My favorite companies are Blue Underground and Mono Macabre. I just feel like this most stellar collection of films. But Synapse is great. Vinegar Syndrome is amazing. They're all really great. And you can't, every title I've bought from those companies, every movie has just been fantastic. So this was the first one I picked out because I had seen this podcast and watched this show, and they had the founders, the two guests on the show were the guys who run Synapse, and one of the movies they were talking about was The Creature from Black Lake, and it sounded amazing. It sounded awesome. It's a Bigfoot movie essentially, and it's a creature feature movie, and it's like ultra low budget. It's from 1976, which is just crazy, and it it sounded amazing. So I'm like, this I gotta keep an eye out, and I know when they were talking about the movie, they had just released it like within a few weeks ago. I believe it was a few weeks ago, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna keep whenever I'm in Bull Moose again or whatever, I'll keep it in my radar and try to check it out, see what that's about, see if it's available anywhere, in any of the stores at Bull Moose and those kinds of things. So we went to Bull Moose, and this was the first movie I saw that like totally jumped at me. I was like, oh yes. So super excited, and I watched this last night, and it's amazing. It's so good, and it's such a great movie because it's definitely like a creature feature where it's a good old fashioned kind of monster movie, and it's involves Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and it all takes place in like these like this very murky, kind of swampy area. And again, I never seen this film before, but it's so great. It's such a, and I can't believe it's like 1976. Like the acting is really great, the cast is fantastic, the writing is really great. And the weird thing about this movie is, I believe it was kind of like a TV movie, but it's rated PG, which is crazy because there's not really any gore or too much like excessive violence, but the atmosphere for this film is just incredible. And the monster, Bigfoot, is really great, and he's like generally pretty scary. But the story is really good, the acting is really great, the cast is really great, the direction's really great. The biggest attraction for me for this film is that this film was the cinematography was done by Dean Cundy, who is my favorite cinematographer. This is one of his first films, and Dean Cundy is most famous for doing doing all the cinematography for all of the John Carpenter films. Just amazing, I mean, just an amazing resume or list of films that he's done. Halloween and Escape from New York, and just an endless list of films. He basically did every John Carpenter film. And he worked. There's a really awesome documentary on here. It's an interview. It's like a 19 minute. It's like 19 minutes long, but it's basically an interview with Dean Cundy, and I was just like, oh my god, this is amazing because he's like one of my favorite people in general, and he's definitely my favorite cinematographer. And it's really and this, like I said, this just came out, so the interview was done really recently, and I didn't. It's really interesting. It's super fascinating. I didn't realize Dean Cundy worked. Really, he worked. His background was he was heavily steeped in the whole kind of horror exploitation world. He worked on all of these like super uber low budget horror exploitation movies before, and then he worked on all of these pretty underground obscure films, and then he worked on this. This was his kind of more of his like bigger, I guess you could say was like kind of his big break, or his first kind of full length feature, or up until working on these super low budget films, this was probably one of the biggest ones. But this is also uber low budget. It's a classic, monster creature feature film. It's super low budget. It's from 1976. It's got, I definitely consider this to be kind of like a monster exploitation movie. And it's kind of cheesy. It's pretty silly, but it's actually really great. It's actually really good quality. And again, the thing that's so crazy about this film is that it's PG, and I believe this was like a TV movie. I think one of my all-time favorite movies in general, and my favorite horror exploitation movie of all time, which I did a show on a ways back, was Tourist Trap, and that movie is essentially rated PG also. But it's such a bizarre, and it's one of the creepiest movies that I've ever seen. I just think it's so great, and I've always thought that movie stood out in my brain because I love horror and science fiction so much. Those are my favorite styles, and I always felt this movie has a new level of that. It's a very disturbing, strange movie. And again, it's super cheesy, it's super low budget, and it's kind of terrible, but it's so great at the same time. But essentially, it's rated PG. So it's not very gory. It's not very gory at all. But it's just the way, it's just the environment that the film creates, and the atmosphere that just makes this film makes that film Tourist Trap so like creepy and weird and strange and bizarre. And and again, I love huge fan of practical effects. I love slasher films to death. Those are probably my favorite. I love super gory films. I have a high threshold for copious amounts of violence and copious amounts of sex on screen. That doesn't bother me. And I like films that have that, as long as the story's there. But I love, those aspects of it, especially, around films, filmmakers that I can think of that really show that those kinds of things, like Jess Franco or Lucio Fulci. They really, have lots of those elements in their films, but they're great stories. But I also like films that they have these certain kinds of restrictions, and that they can get away with creating that same kind of vibe without actually showing it. And Tourist Trap is one of those films. It's rated PG, and there's virtually no gore in that film, but yet it's, to me, one of the creepiest creepiest films ever made, and my favorite exploitation movie. It's kind of a knockoff of Texas Chainsaw Massacre because it had come out right after that. And to me, it's testimony of, like, really these guys, having to use their imagination to a higher extent to be creative and to kind of get the point across without being, without having those limitations of they're just not going to be allowed to show copious amounts of violence and blood, but they can create this atmosphere. And this movie, Creature from the Black Lake, is for me the same thing. It's a PG TV movie essentially. It doesn't feel like a TV movie, but from what I've read about it, I think it was on cable for a long time. It feels like a great low budget exploitation movie that you would see on the screen. So it doesn't quite feel like a television movie. But apparently this was shown on television quite a bit. It was in syndication, and I think it might have even premiered on television. It didn't have, I don't believe, a huge like theatrical release, but essentially, technically, it's a TV movie, and it was like given all these, it was given lots of praise by like TV Guide back in the day, which is just crazy. But again, with its limitations, it still has a really great horror factor. There's no blood. There's not really any violence in it per se. Well, there is, but there's not a lot of gore. There's no sex in it. But yet the atmosphere is so great. And I think for a film like this, and like how I mentioned Tourist Trap, those limitations, being because of the ratings of these films, almost enhances the experience. Like the filmmakers have to be even more creative on how to like get that point across without just not being able to show all of the gore. And I just think it's awesome that and this film has that. Like, it's still really dark. It's really funny. It's kind of goofy and campy, but it's actually the monster Sasquatch is actually pretty terrifying in the film. And when you see him, it's really pretty intense, and the atmosphere is just great. Just really, really awesome. And it's not like a kids movie. It doesn't, even though it could be considered a kids movie, it's really not. I don't think. Whenever the monster appears, and the other thing that I love about it is they don't really. Dean Cundy's cinematography is just so spectacular, and I love that they don't really show the monster in the movie that much. Like, you see shades of him, and it takes place in the swamp, and it's in the woods, and it's at night. And there's all these people that are getting killed in the film, but you don't really see it. You just see glimmers of it, and you see him kind of appear. There's only like really one scene or two in the film where you actually see Bigfoot in his full glory. And I think that's really, like, it goes into that thing that I've talked about a lot in the past, like the whole less is more. It leaves a lot up to your imagination. And so it creates this really dark atmosphere and kind of ambience around that. And this movie totally is awesome with delivering that kind of that kind of vibe. Just very impressive. The cast, like I said, is tremendous. Jack Elam is in this. Dennis Fimple, Dub Taylor, John David Carson, Bill Thurman. And a lot of these actors, Jim Elam was a famous actor in a lot of the classic Western movies, a lot of the John Ford movies. Dennis Fimple, I've seen him in tons of television and TV movies. And the same thing with Dub Taylor. Another kind of iconic character actor. Every time you see his face, you recognize him because he's been in he was in tons of like television movies, tons of movies. He played these small little roles, sometimes bigger roles. But the cast is great, and the writing is really great for this film. I was really surprised on how you know well done this film was. I was Yeah, I was kind of blown away. And again, it's definitely I consider a classic, kind of creature feature horror exploitation movie. It definitely has that vibe. And they were talking about in the special features how this film came out, right when Jaws kind of came out, and there's certain similarities between the two as far as, you know, like with Steven Spielberg's classic movie, Jaws. You don't really see the shark until like later into the movie, and when you do see him, it's like pretty sporadic. You don't, but it's like really effective when you don't see him and you don't see the monster. And they were talking about that in the special features. They were talking about the parallels of that, and I thought that was really interesting. This director for John John Hook, or I should say, sorry, Joy Hook Jr., who was the director of this film. I had never, you know, heard of him before, and he's made a whole bunch of movies. Apparently from like the '60s on to all the way up to 94. Women, Women in Bloody Terror is one of his films. Night of Bloody Horror, The Brain Machine, Night of the Strangler, and then this classic here, Creature from the Black Lake, and the Saint Tammy Miracle. Super cool. Again, a whole nother discovery of a filmmaker that I've never seen before, a whole nother discovery of this ultra cool movie I've never heard of before. But just awesome. And the packaging is really great. I was, just super excited when I saw that Dean Cundy was involved and that this is one of his bigger films, or like kind of this started his career more or less. He went on after this to be in Halloween. And again, he's my favorite cinematographer. So, if you're a fan of like the classic monster movie, you know, in kind of the exploitation world, like super low budget, and also it being very super low budget, where it's fun, campy, but generally scary. This is great. This is such an awesome movie. Never seen this before. I'm looking forward to watching this again. I watched this last night for the very first time. Creature from Black Lake. Killer movie. Killer atmosphere. All thanks to the brilliant and iconic Dean Cunley. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean here at Film Fanatic, and we will see you again, and have a great day. Peace.